All right, everybody. Mr. Arnke back with you for Sec 110. We're going into Chapter 2 today, Malware and Social Engineering Attacks. So we're going to talk about the definition of malware, list a couple of different types, look at some payloads, and look at the types of psychological engineering attacks that we may have to deal with as well. Social engineering is a fairly common way to breach security without arousing suspicion, mostly because a lot of people don't realize how valuable certain types of information are. We're also going to talk about physical social engineering attacks as well. So malicious software is the contraction or the portmanteau that we use to create the word malware. It enters a user system without the knowledge or consent of the owner. So again, it's an or statement. So we may have, they know they're downloading something, but they don't know what it is, or they don't consent to having it downloaded, but it's a drive-by. This is going to use threat vectors in order to deliver a malicious payload that performs harmful functions once invoked. Now, the invocation can occur based on a timer, it can occur based on set conditionals to different programs that are being opened, or it can be instantaneous once it completes. Malware is just a general term referring to a wide variety of damaging or annoying software, which is a fairly common thing that we deal with on a daily basis. A lot of people don't think about how much of it gets blocked, though. The nature of like spam filters and now browsers. Microsoft has Smart Screen and Chrome has their little blocking thing that they come up with. I think Firefox has one as well. There's a lot of preventative stuff that automatically comes up. Malware is often classified by 4 primary traits: circulation, infection, concealment, and payload capability. Circulation is spreading into other systems to impact a number of users. Infection is the method of embedding. Concealment is how we avoid detection by scanners. And payload capabilities are the different actions the malware performs once it has been downloaded and is, as we said, invoked. So when we talk about circulation malware, we've got 2 primary candidates: viruses and worms. A virus is malicious code that reproduces locally, which means that it's not going to worry about network-based stuff unless, of course, there is a user action that allows this. It relies on user action for propagation. A program virus tends to infect executables, and that is what we are most used to seeing. Macro viruses can affect documents as opposed to an executable. These are a series of instructions grouped together as a single command. Macro viruses are commonly written in scripts. So more often than not, you're going to see these in PowerPoints. You're going to see them in Excel spreadsheets. And most common of all is a Word document. These macros are basically little snippets of code that allow expanded functionality. So if you get into Excel, what's called VBA programming, it's an augmented scripting thing that Microsoft has done in conjunction with Office in order to enhance the functionality of spreadsheets in Microsoft Excel, so that way you can add in certain functionality that wasn't present in Word or customize a function. This is where potentially malicious code can be executed. Early virus infection methods was the appender infection. So the earliest microprocessor virus that I'm aware of was called the elk cloner virus. This is where it would attach itself to the boot sector of a floppy disk. You would put the floppy disk into a drive, and it was really smart. It had a little check disk bit, essentially. It had a little check function that said if it was already infected with elk cloner, it wouldn't try and infect it twice. So it was keeping its activities quiet, even though antivirus, of course, did not yet exist. Appender infections is where the virus will attach itself to the end of a file. It's pretty easy to detect because then we can see the change in the file size. And it's pretty easy for the virus scanner to clip off the affected portion because we know where the original code is if we can track the jump instructions. Most viruses today go to great lengths to avoid detection, which is why we now call them armored viruses. One of the simplest methods of armoring is to run a Swiss cheese infection. This is where a virus is going to split itself into scrambled pieces in order to be more difficult to detect. It'll follow no seeming pattern in order to inject itself at different sections of the infected code. Split infection is where it will split itself into several parts at random positions. This is kind of close to Swiss cheese, but the main difference is there is also garbage code that's included to mask the purpose. With a traditional Swiss cheese infection, You know, the stuff goes back and forth, but there's a pretty linear way of tracking down the code. With a split infection, because of the garbage code, it's not really as trackable. So you usually have to have something that is clearly indicative of where the original source code was, or you just delete the infected file and recover a new version, reinstall or things like that. Mutation armoring. This is where viruses can actually change. So there's three primary categories: oligomorphics, polymorphics, and metamorphics. Oligomorphic is going to change its internal code to one of a set of predefined mutations. So let's say a particular oligomorphic virus is going to come in and it has 5 different forms that it can take. Now, this may be changed according to what operating system it's on. It may be to, you know, a particular seed time based on the system clock. There's any number of trigger circumstances that are there, but it's going to try and change itself from its original signature so that way it is harder to detect. Polymorphics completely change from their original form on execution. So this is where it'll unpack and compile, usually through use of what's called a bootstrapping sequence. Metamorphics will rewrite their own code and appear different every time they're executed, but they do have a source that, if you get to the original file, can be identified. So each of these are trying to shield by means of change. That's what that is what mutate means. Is it means to change. So here we can see some graphic representations of Swiss cheese and split infections. You see here that with the Swiss cheese infection, there are some encrypted chunks that are floating around. With the split infection, it's entire lines of code. And you can see again that there's a, you know, just kind of a random sectioning of code that goes about with this. Now, viruses tend to perform 2 actions. It'll go ahead and drop the payload and then reproduce. So it's going to try and perform some form of malicious action and then try and reproduce itself by passing itself to another file. Things viruses can do once the payload has been inserted and invoked, causing your computer to crash, you know, by consumption of resources or things like that, or it can cause a memory error. Erasing files from your hard drive or reformatting them. And then this is kind of the proto-mutating sequence, turning off computer security settings so that aspects of the virus are either undetectable or what the virus is doing is not being monitored. Now, as I said earlier when we got started with this section, viruses cannot automatically spread to another computer. They have to spread based on, as I said with the ELK cloner, you know, you have an infected floppy, or if you have a more modern sequence, obviously, you have an infected flash drive, sometimes an optical disk if it's written from an infected ISO. If you download a file, if you email an attachment, these are all going to be ways that we can spread that infection. Now, a worm's a little bit different. This is focused specifically on propagation on its own. It's going to use a computer network to replicate and send itself to other network devices, attempting to find purchase on said devices. So if we look at the graphic here on the right, we can compare the difference between a virus and a worm. The virus is dealing with manipulation of local files, whereas a worm deals with manipulation of vulnerabilities to escape its host system and spread somewhere else. So, does a virus infect a file? Yes. Does a worm infect a file? No. It's a standalone piece of code. User action is not necessary for remote for access of a worm to a system, and it can be remote controlled. Worms can consume resources. It can leave behind a payload to harm infected systems. So you can have a worm that carries a virus, but unless that is the primary mode of execution, at that point it would become a virus. Most virus and worm definitions have to be very, very rigorous. We have to say, you know, it's primary method of attack, not a secondary. You could have a virus that does deploy something worm-like, and you could have a worm that deploys something virus-like. That is very common. Now, when we talk about infection malware, stuff that specifically is trying to infect and spread, we have Trojans, ransomware, and crypto-malware. Now, a Trojan, based on the story of the siege of Troy from the Greek myth, I believe it's the Iliad. The Trojan is an executable program that does something other than advertised. it can contain hidden code that launches an attack of some kind. It's often made to appear as a standard data file, or it can be included as part of a file that has been cracked. If you have a game or something like, in the common era, it would be something like Cyberpunk 2077. That's a really popular game, so people may want to play it, but they may not want to pay the price tag, which is a big no-no because there's lots of people who have not only is it illegal, but it's really unethical. You have a lot of people who've invested a lot of money into trying to get that game up and running, and you're not paying respect to the work that was done when you pirate. So, for example, let's look at something that's non-pirate related. A user downloads a free calendar program of some kind, which is kind of ridiculous because obviously Windows already comes with one, Linux already comes with one, Mac already comes with one. Okay. Now, this one may have, fancy icons or things like that. Once it's downloaded, whatever the purpose may be, the program is going to scan the system for credit card numbers, usernames, other personally identifiable information or PII, and then passwords. So it will look for, a character of 16 numbers in a sequence that may be followed by two-digit blocks separated by a slash. You can have different format strings that try to look for things that may be indicative of potentially valuable information. Once that information is procured, it's going to be transmitted to the attacker through the network. So it's usually going to be some kind of utility that advertises the ability to automatically update or similar. A special type of Trojan you may run into is called a RAT, or Random Access Trojan. This is going to give a threat actor unauthorized remote access to your computer, usually by modifying things on either the FTP or RDP protocol sets. So that would either be file transfer or remote desktop protocol. Ransomware is going to prevent a device from operating properly until a fee is paid. It is highly profitable. You see stories about companies getting hit for, $1 million Bitcoin ransom or things like that. There's also a variant that is not quite as dangerous, and it just explains that there's some kind of license that has expired, or there's some sort of problem, and it requires that you purchase additional software to fix it, or download another piece of software. I have seen variants of ransomware where the software in question is free, but what it contains is usually a Trojan or a rootkit or something similar. Crypto-malware. This is a much more aggressive form of ransomware where threat actors will actually encrypt all of the files on your device, so none of them could be opened. Now, once infected with crypto-malware, the software is going to connect to a threat actor's command and control server to receive instructed or updated data. A locking key is generated for encrypting the files, and then that key is encrypted with another key that has been downloaded from the CNC. Second key is sent to the victims once they pay the ransom. So you can see here the instructions on the right of what is done in order to make this happen. So yeah, these are no bueno. You definitely don't want to see them. At this point, what I usually recommend is to say, hey, let's go ahead and just go ahead and fry it and restore from a backup. You do have a backup, right? So it's an important thing to be aware of. Concealment malware. Rootkits, I just mentioned a second ago. Rootkits are software tools used by an attacker to hide the actions or presence of other types of malicious software. So this can hide or remove traces of login records for users, or log entries of changes to files or modifications, things like that. It may also alter or replace operating system files with modified versions that are specifically designed to ignore malicious activity. So this may add keys to your registry, this may change your startup sequence, things like that. Once the computer contains a rootkit, the rootkit is in charge, and users can no longer trust that their machine is doing what they ask it to do, including things like running anti-malware or being able to securely delete files. What's actually occurring on the computer is being concealed by the rootkit, depending on what activity is there and what type of rootkit is being employed. Payload malware, data collection, data deletion, system mods, and launching of attacks. So different types of malware are designed to collect data from users' computers and then make it available at the attacker's request. This would include, of course, things like spyware and adware. Spyware is going to gather information without consent, using computer resources for collecting and distributing personal or sensitive information. You can see here the one on the right, the eCOD soft, or whatever is keylogger. worked for things like MSN Chat, Docs and Files, Facebook, Yahoo, AIM, ICQ, Twitter, all of these different things that it knew to look for specific cookies. It could also look for the clipboard, CD-ROM files. Now, because the log file only keeps track of certain pieces of information, sometimes this would be a very large register, sometimes it would be very, very small. It could also use delta compression to shrink down. At the end of the day, it would shrink X number of archives and keep them in a secret place so that the person who installed it or had access to it could remotely come in and grab that. Keyloggers are going to capture and store individual keystrokes. You can see here that this particular keylogger also includes a specific one for the keyboard as well as for working in applications. So this is not just going to be general keylog stuff, it's going to say what application it was attached to. You can also search for captured text for things like passwords, credit cards, and personal information to be able to identify potential intrusions. Keyloggers can be small hardware devices or software programs. As hardware, it's inserted between the keyboard and the USB port. Keyloggers in software form are programs that are designed to silently capture information. Strangely enough, in my experience at least, hardware keyloggers are less likely to be noticed. Because think about how infrequently you actually look at the back of your PC. If you have a desktop, if you work in an office and have a desktop. Now, with a laptop, obviously, anything that protrudes out of the sides, you're going to be like, well, what is this? But not a common thing with a desktop. An advantage of software keyloggers for an attacker is that they do not require physical access, so they can be installed and then tracked remotely. With the hardware-based keylogger, even if they re-image the operating system every time it loads, you can still have that hardware keylogger being able to track information. The difference is the driver going to be able to store the information until you can come back and retrieve it, or is it attached to a program that will then transmit information back and forth? There's a lot of different variables, so it's something we want to be aware of. Adware is a program that delivers advertising content in a way that is unexpected and unwanted by the user. This traditionally will do, banners, pop-ups, change your start page, things like that, pop up new browser windows. Users traditionally are not down with this because adware can put up objectionable content, so pornography or medications or trying to sell things on the dark web. So it could be weapons or things that just generally would be considered offensive. Frequent pop-up ads can interfere with productivity. They can consume computer resources, slowing it down. They can even cause data loss, crashes, corruption, and it's just a nuisance. Remember, part of the whole malware thing, mal from the French being bad, is just something in bad faith. It's just it doesn't do what we expect it to do, so it's considered malicious, and that's why we wish to remove it. Deletion of data. Certain types of malware will actually just blow data away and remove pointers and references and stuff. Logic bombs, these are computer code pieces that lie dormant until they're triggered by a specific logical event. Before it's triggered, it's really hard to find. They're often embedded in computer programs that aren't routinely scanned. So, something like the Microsoft Management Console for a standard workstation. Even something like the Windows calculator, it may not necessarily get a lot of scanning. Backdoors, modification of system security. This is where access to a particular host, program, or service is able to circumvent normal security, so the attacker can come in and bypass security at their leisure, usually at a time when the computer is unlikely to be active. Launching attacks. Of course, we all know about botnets and zombies. Bots are infected computers that are under the control of a remote attacker. Now we can group these computers together into a logical network called a botnet. Zombies go into botnets, bots go into botnets. Bots and zombies are interchangeable. They're under the control of the attacker, who is then known as a bot herder. Now you can have multiple bot herders working in concert, or you can have kind of this intermediate hierarchy structure to where you can have a CNC server that controls X number of bots, and then that CNC server reports back to another one. And all it's doing is essentially relaying either HTTP or ICMP messages. So you can see spamming, spreading malware, manipulating online polls, denying services. All of these things have been found as common uses for botnets. Social engineering, always a fun one. Social engineering is just a means of gathering information for an attack by relying on the psychological weaknesses of individuals. Social engineering can involve psychological and physical approaches. So let's look at the life cycle. We've got investigation, which is where we lay down some groundwork. We identify who we're going after. We find some info. We select our methods. The hook, which is where we try and gain a foothold by engaging the target, spinning a story, and steering the interaction. We determine the outcome by saying we are going to create parameters so that there is only one feasible outcome based on what we know about this individual. That's why the recon and investigation section is so important. Play, this is where we obtain information over a period of time once we have the foothold. So we have to do kind of a pre and post. We're going to make some assumptions during the investigation, and we're going to try and either confirm, deny, or expand those assumptions during the play sequence. Once the foothold has been established, we're going to execute the attack, disrupt the business, and or siphon data. Now this play sequence may be very, very long. That's usually the longest piece of the life cycle. Ideally, without arousing suspicion, we then want to close the interaction, removing all traces of what we've done, and then bring the charade of impersonation or whatever we're doing to a natural end. A lot of the time, interactions with an individual are going to be done very, very briefly because the longer that you stay in that interaction, the more identifiable you are. So you want to make sure that the story that you fabricate is believable, very innocuous, and something that's easy to remember. A lot of people find that the investigation process of a social engineering attack breaks down when the person is unable to keep up with what lies they have told, what falsehoods they're using. So you'll see that there's a lot of common tactics to try and break into that. You'll notice that I'm talking as an attacker when I go through this life cycle, and that is because in order to defend from attackers, you must be able to think like one. And that's an important aspect, even if it's not your natural mode. I tend to feel like I have a pretty strong moral compass, and my feeling is if I don't find a way to put myself in these kinds of shoes, I will not be able to provide suitable defenses for my clients who need protection from social engineering. How do we inform people who are going to be potential victims? How do we identify where something seems like unusual interaction in a workplace or in a social setting? How do we identify, somebody who seems to be targeting us, out of nowhere? How do we identify what seems to be a genuine interaction versus an insincere one? So again, think like an attacker. If you want to be a cybersecurity analyst, if you want to work in cybersecurity in general, you got to be able to kind of switch that other side of your brain on. The psychological approach towards social engineering is to provide or to gain information by persuading the victim to take action either by means of verbal confirmation or denial of facts, or by actually doing something. Attackers use a variety of techniques to gain trust without moving quickly. Now, as I just said in the previous slide, most interactions are fast, but if you feel that there is a need to, you can parlay these out a little bit longer. You can provide a reason for interaction. Of course, you want it to seem as benign as possible. Somebody looks as though they're in a piece of authority. You can play that, you're just kind of befuddled. You don't know where you are. It's your first day, or you're making a meeting with someone, and you're just like, I really don't know where I'm going. I'm sorry to bother you, but could I, again, you project confidence to where there's no outcome but you doing what I want. So I'm going to automatically assume that every piece of this interaction is going to involve you playing along. And, use evasion and diversion to move around whenever we hit a roadblock. So a lot of the time what psychological social engineers will do is that they will role play this kind of stuff with each other quite a bit, because again, think like a crook to catch a crook, so that's what you got to do. You got to test yourself to see if somebody else says, nah, that seems a little bit obvious, we might want to flex that. You can do that. Another way to get around things is to make people laugh. If you make them feel as though it's a lighthearted interaction, and if you're, kind of, again, befuddled, you've got foibles and are flawed and are not able to do something, and they can, people generally like to have a psychological feeling of being able to help out, be helpful, be friendly. It's what we try and drill people on doing in all their interactions. From the time you're a little kid, you're taught that if you can help somebody, you should, but you often don't think about the fact that that can leave you vulnerable to these types of exploits. Psychological approaches often involve impersonation, phishing for information, spam to prime you, hoaxes to make people react as opposed to thinking before they act, and watering hole attacks to where we take advantage of something that is a common meeting point, either physically or electronically, for individuals. So impersonation, of course, is where the attacker is pretending to be someone else. And you can see from the list here, it's usually somebody who's an external source, except for, manager or fellow employee. So you see a situation where those are either going to try and play on a sense of camaraderie, especially if it's a very large company. And then if you have a manager situation, this is usually not going to be done in person. This will be done electronically. Hopefully that person, the attacker at least, if they're doing their job correctly, will have procured a number of emails to figure out what somebody's tone is like when they write emails. Does somebody misspell a particular word? Does somebody have a particular email signature that they always use? That kind of thing. Attackers will often impersonate someone in authority because victims generally resist saying no to them. Having worked in both physical and in cybersecurity, I will tell you, that happens a lot. You'll have people who will come at you, and generally, if you buck any resistance, you'll see the facade shift. Not necessarily that it will break, but you'll see it shift where they have to kind of pause and counterpoint to be like, okay, if they resist, now I'm going to do this. Sometimes they'll come at you really aggressively. Sometimes they'll try and be a bit more wheedling, that kind of, oh, come on, man, we're on the same team here. I've worked here for a couple of years, and I lost my password, or I forgot my key, or I forgot my badge, or da da da. So the tactics are going to vary just as much as any attack will, but it's important to understand, does this make sense? Does this seem like a usual operation? Is this something that is explicitly prohibited in the employee handbook or in whatever, organizational circumstance you're in? Phishing, my goodness, all of the different items that could be there. You see here on the right, there's a phishing email message to where somebody got said, hey, thank you for the payment that you made to somebody in the amount of, $1,297.20, blah, 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 and you look at it, and the email has all of the livery that you expect to see. And there's also some very convenient links, but I imagine if we were to actually hover over these links, we would see that the redirect email addresses are slightly different. All of these things are difficult to distinguish from legitimate sites, so we have to use a little bit of observation to make sure that we're not getting something that is intended to make us take action and leave us vulnerable to login activity. Variations on phishing attacks. Spear phishing, of course, would be to target specific users. Spear is a single target. Whaling goes after big fishes, individuals or organizations that are wealthy or in possession of strong resources. Phishing is where you use phone calls instead of emails. About 97% of all attacks that have been documented start with phishing, meaning that there needs to be some kind of pretext in order to gain information to produce the results in the attack. Spam. Unsolicited email, about 90% of all emails sent. So about out of 10 trillion emails being sent every year, and that number is a ballpark, but that's pretty close. 10 trillion emails, 1 trillion emails is just, that's the useful stuff. Everything else is junk. 9 out of 10 emails is just junk. So when you hear that, then think about what happens with spam filters. What are they actually going to do? Like how much email would you get if you didn't have that in place? So these are primary vehicles for distribution of malware, trying to gain clicks, things like that. And they're very lucrative because cost is virtually none. You go in, you create a couple of things, you throw a Photoshop graphic together, you get some random links together, you copy and paste some text, you get some bit.ly or whatever shortcut links put together you can, and then boom, put it together. Now, filters for spam are often limited by the fact that they look for particular words and block emails based on textual content. In order to circumvent this, there is image spam. So if we look on the right-hand graphic, we read it like we would any other email. We would see text, we would see graphics, and they would be separate. We'd be able to highlight the text and click and drag and stuff. If we were to just treat this as an image without any text involved, we were using pictures of words as opposed to words in a manipulable sense, we can read that as people because that's how our brains are built to process. But With machines, it's a little bit different. So in order to circumvent text-based filters, these graphical images will also often include nonsense text. So if we look at the bottom, we see here it says, about noon I stopped at the captain's door with some cooling drinks and medicines. He looked like we left him. He looked weak. He wanted to talk, but he could not. The end was near. And then there's some text about the facts about motorcycle helmets. So they probably took some more benign mailing list style emails and just copy and pasted chunks so that way they seemed legitimate. Because again, if you were to just get an email that had an image in it and no text, that would be something that the filter would say, hey, this seems a little suspicious. Then we get into protection of things like that using postmarks, trusted senders, so then we get into black and white listing. Spam is a very lucrative business, and until it stops being so, we're always going to have to find ways to have defenses against it. Hoaxes. In the modern era, because people have gotten a little bit better about not responding to random emails from external sources, most of them have to spoof coming from the IT department. So this is an attack that could try and get a victim to change configuration settings on their computers, to dial in to a particular service by means of a provided username and password, which once logged in could act as an RDDP portal. You know, there's all kinds of different ways it can happen. But again, hoaxes deal with trying to force some kind of action. So you always want to make sure that you're paying attention to what's going on whenever you get an email telling you that you need to do something. If you are getting an email from your IT department, go onto your company's website, grab the IT number, or go from your company directory and contact them directly. Don't let them don't try and contact them through a number that they provide in the email, because that could be a number that goes to, a Google Voice number that they set up that obviously, they're going to control. So you always want to be aware with hoaxes that there's not only danger in the attack itself, but in the resultant of, trying to contact and verify to make sure that something is legitimate. Watering hole attacks. These are malicious attacks directed towards small groups of individuals who visit the same site. So the example they give us here is that major executives working for a manufacturing company may visit a parts supplier site. So they could be getting invoices or bill of lading printouts, or they could be checking prices, they could be checking availability, all of these things. So basically, if we can use DNS poisoning as an attacker, we can set up a redirect or a man-in-the-middle attack to capture credentials. So we always want to be aware that, even if we are keeping things secure on our end, there are things out there that could be vulnerable, that could be manipulated outside of our control. So we still need to make sure that we're being cautious, using two-factor authentication, HTTPS wherever possible, making sure we're aware of zone changes whenever we're moving between secure and non-secure websites, that sort of thing. Physical procedures. Dumpster diving and tailgating. Dumpster diving is literally what it sounds like, digging through trash to find information that can be useful in an attack. Calendars, inexpensive computer hardware, phone directories, policy manuals. Policy manuals are really, really dangerous if they get out there. Phone directories, org charts. An electronic variation of this is basically Google hacking, using the Google search engine to look for documents and data posted online, especially because a lot of small businesses may use Google Drive or Google Sites to be able to share things, especially with outside vendors, so the permissions may be a little bit janky. This is also called Google dorking, so if you ever hear that term, that's what it means. Tailgating, this is where we have an unauthorized individual following an authorized individual through an access door. They go ahead and swipe their badge or access code or key or whatever else, and they walk in. The other person catches the door before it seals. Now, there could be a situation where an employee could conspire with an unauthorized person to allow them to walk in as well, and this is called piggybacking. So tailgating is going to be without the compliance of the individual that actually has authorized access. Piggybacking means that they would have conspiracy involved. Watching an authorized user enter a security code on a keypad, enter a password, copy down a phone number, this is all called shoulder surfing. So there's a couple of different things that we see that are very similar to tailgating but have some different names. And that is Chapter 2. So if you have any questions or concerns, as always, I am available via email, direct message, or through my Google Voice number, which you can pull from the syllabus page. If you have any concerns that need to be addressed before next class, please feel free to either message me through my Google Voice number or leave a comment. I always like hearing ways in which I can try and improve these videos, try and make it easier for you guys to be able to absorb the content and be able to understand what we're trying to deal with here. So, as per usual, thank you so much for your time and attention. I very much appreciate all of you, and I hope to see you again next class.